Game Week 26 FPL transfer plans. In today's video, I'll be running through my transfer plans for the next few game weeks in FPL, including my strategy moving forward and who the best manager is to be using the assistant manager chip on this game week. Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey, and in today's video, I'll be running through my transfer plans ahead of Game Week 26, but also my strategy over the next few weeks in FPL, including and running up to Game Week 29, which will be a blank game week for 4 teams, that being Liverpool, Villa, Newcastle and Crystal Palace. Now, the first thing to note is that I'm currently looking at running through Game Week 29 with only the use of my transfers rather than using a free hit. So the moves that I make over the next few game weeks will be with the blank Game Week 29 in mind, and possibly even my moves this week will incorporate players that specifically have fixtures and that I want to own come Game Week 29. I'll probably be looking at wildcarding fairly shortly after Game Week 29. We think we'll get news on what the double game week in 33 will be around about game week 30 or 31. So I'll probably be wildcarding in 31 when we've got that information. In the meantime, though, I've got 6 players that are blanking in game week 29, that being 3 Liverpool assets, Trent, Salah, and the injured Cody Gakpo, more on that later, and then 2 Newcastle, that being Lewis Hall and Isak. Rodgers came in last minute for me for game week 25. He's the only Villa player I need to worry about. No Crystal Palace at the moment. And of course, I've got Emery as my assistant manager, who won't be an issue come game week 29 because the chip won't be active anymore. So I've got 6 players. A few of them I will be looking at moving on in the next few game weeks. Liverpool have 2 fixtures in a row now in game week 26 and game week 27 that don't look the best. But obviously, game week 28 against Southampton does look good, so I don't want to get rid of the likes of Salah, let's say, for example, ahead of game week 28 against Southampton, because that's going to be a prime opportunity for him. Outside of that, though, Gakpo is definitely looking like an issue. Man City, followed by Newcastle in the next 2 game weeks, doesn't look ideal, and then when you compile that with the fact that he is currently injured, obviously I had him for the double game week in 25. At time of recording, it looks very unlikely he's even going to be fit for the second of those 2 games against Aston Villa in the midweek. So that's really not worked out for me. Although I did have him for a 16-pointer in game week 23, I think it was. So it hasn't been all bad news, but Gakpo has been frustrating. I am probably going to be looking at moving him on. He could be fit for the Man City game, but considering he's been out for about a week, it possibly might be a bit longer as well, he might be a little bit rusty, so I'm not massively convinced in holding on to him, especially when there are other strikers that I might like the look of and will want come game week 29. This might be an opportunity for me. Similar goes for Trent. Obviously, he came back in, got 60 minutes, luckily came off before the clean sheet was wiped out against Wolves in game week 25, that is, and is likely to be playing against Aston Villa. But again, you're not looking for clean sheets for the Man City game or the Newcastle game necessarily, and I'll be holding on to him for that Southampton game. So I think that those 2 Liverpool assets in particular are able to be moved on, but not necessarily people that I need to move on. Gakpo probably more so, especially if he's still injured. Trent I could hold on to for a little while longer. Now, looking at the Newcastle boys, Isak, I'm tempted to hold on as long as I can because Newcastle's fixtures, whilst not amazing, they're not terrible either. And Nottingham Forest at home doesn't look like the worst fixture right now. He's obviously still been in red hot form, so I don't want to get rid of him unless I absolutely have to. Lewis Hall is a possible sell, but I do have value tied up in him, so I'm not necessarily set on getting rid of him just yet, especially when I've got other issues like the Liverpool assets that I could remove value from to upgrade elsewhere. And of course, I do need to deal with my assistant manager chip this week. Now, I've got a section planned and dedicated to the assistant manager chip, so more on that later, but it does look likely that I'm going to want to move it on from Unai Emery. Now, of course, I've only got 2 free transfers to play with, so if I was to use one on the assistant manager this week, then I've only got 1 to use on my players in my starting 11. Gakpo could be a concern. I've got João Pedro on my bench with an ideal fixture, but he's not even in the starting 11 for Brighton at the moment, so that feels very risky to be using him. And Morgan Rodgers is arguably a player that could also be moved on with a blank coming up in game week 29. Not great fixtures between now and then either, and although he could be a decent hold against Chelsea, he'll have played 3 games in a week by that point, so he might not be the easiest person to hold on to, especially when there are other cheap options with good upside and a game in game week 29 that I could be transferring him out for. It does look fairly likely that a hit could be taken in game week 26 to correct the ship a little bit, move on the assistant manager, but also make a couple of changes to my starting 11 and shore up my team as we start moving ahead towards game week 29 and giving myself a couple more players that don't blank in that game week. So first off, let's take a look at the assistant manager chip and which managers are most likely to provide the highest upside, statistically at least, going into game week 26. So to analyze the assistant manager chip this week, I've used a fantastic graphic from Rob T FPL. Do go check him out on social media if you get the chance. He does some brilliant work on there. But this goes a long way as to showing where the upside might lie for some of the assistant manager choices going into game week 26. Now, the first and most important thing to mention here is that the likes of Slot and Unai Emery, who are the two most popular assistant managers to own right now going into game week 26, so obviously they both had double game weeks in 25. A lot of you have already got Slot. Some of you have Unai Emery like myself. They're projected to not do too badly themselves in game week 26. And the highest upside on average is going to be Arteta with 8.4 points. Now, if you move down to Slot, who is lower mid-table, and Unai Emery, who's even lower than that, on average, let's say this game was played out, or this game week was played out 100 times, they're projected to get 5.5 points in Slot's case and 4.9 points in Emery's case on average. Obviously, there'll be a lot of noise applied to that. So if we were to have 100 simulations of this game week, in some they'd get 0, some they'd get a few, maybe a draw, and then some they'd get the win, obviously. But we're projecting based on the bookies data. Unai Emery has a 36% chance, again with the bookies, you might think differently, of beating Chelsea, and a 25% chance of a draw. So he's got just over 60% chance of getting some sort of result against Chelsea, and therefore points of some kind. The same goes for Slot as well. So a 41% chance of beating Man City, a 25% chance of getting a draw. So there's only about a 1 in 3 chance of Slot not coming away with some kind of result and therefore points of any description. Might obviously get a goal, but that's not really that valuable to us. Whereas the highest upside on average is Arteta, 8.4 points, is only 3 points, maybe 3.5 points ahead of some of the most popular picks. So what is the point I'm trying to make here? Well, the point is, if we were to look at the data, on average, if you were to run this simulation hundreds and hundreds of times, if you were going to take a hit to get rid of either Slot or Emery, on average, it probably wouldn't pay off. Now, that's not to say it can't pay off, but it's something that I'm weighing into my thinking that if I am going to move away from Emery and a hit looks likely within my starting 11, I need to be very careful as to where I'm backing for the assistant manager chip this week. And I think because I've got issues in my starting 11 that would probably mean that I do need to take a hit overall, I could, let's say in my mind anyway, say that the hit is part of the players that I'm getting rid of rather than the assistant manager, but it all really works out the same way. It's still a transfer that you're using that costs a hit down the line potentially. So with Unai Emery, the upside doesn't look great against Chelsea, but Chelsea haven't looked great themselves. What I would say is that Emery and Villa will have played a couple of games, including that midweek game against Liverpool. So they might be a bit leggy, they might be a bit tired, and I'm not massively confident that they get a great result against Chelsea. Obviously, it's a home game. They might do something, but I do also quite like the upside of some of the other picks here. So I'm tempted to make the move regardless, unless, of course, they look absolutely fantastic on Wednesday night against Liverpool, and I'm confident that they do get a result against Chelsea. But I think personally there is still upside to be gotten in chasing the table bonus. Now, anything highlighted red on the graphic here is a table bonus fixture. So that means the team that they're playing is 5 or more places above, and therefore they get the bonus points if they get some kind of result. So 10 extra points for the win, 5 extra points for the draw. So there's massive upside if they were to get a result. Glasner for me comes top of the pile, 8 points projected, but of course there is the massive upside in the variance there. So they're projected at least a 26% chance of a win, 28% chance of a draw. So overall, just over 50% chance of getting some kind of table bonus in that fixture. If they get a draw, it's not massive upside. They're looking at maybe an 8, 9, 10 pointer at most. But if they were to get a win away at Fulham, that could be massive. We could be looking at a 20 pointer. Now, it is worth noting that Fulham have looked really tight in the last 6 game weeks. I think they're the best statistical defence in terms of underlying defensive data across those 6 game weeks. And their form has been very, very strong. Crystal Palace haven't been bad themselves, but overall, Fulham would probably be expected to get a positive result in that game as it stands. So maybe, even though on paper they look fairly evenly matched, it might not be something that you're interested in. The other one that I do quite like the look of for table bonus is McKenna at home to Spurs, but Spurs will have gotten a whole week of rest going up against Ipswich the following week after obviously beating Man United. Now, Spurs are also getting some injured players coming back at the moment. They've got Vicario back. Obviously, Porro started at right back. Spencer's looked really good at left back. So whilst it's a home fixture and Ipswich don't really look too terrible right now, Delap scoring goals, obviously, again, it's not something that massively convinces me. Now, I don't think it's the greatest week in the world to attack table bonus. Now, I think if I was to attack one, it would probably be Glasner, just because the sides are fairly evenly matched and the upside is certainly there. You're swinging at about a 50%, maybe 55% chance of getting some kind of table bonus. And when you've got a player like Mateta, who's banging form right now up top, you always give yourself a bit of a chance. If you wanted to play it safe, by a long distance, Arteta's the way to go. A 77% chance of a win. So again, that probably gives you a 10 to a 12 pointer, 15% chance of a draw, and obviously the chances of getting nothing out of it are very low. West Ham fans aren't too bullish on the way that Potter and West Ham are playing right now either, but the one thing that's putting me off Arteta is the fact that their forward line looks fairly depleted right now. They needed to pull something out of the bag late on to beat Leicester. And again, it's just not something I've got a great gut feeling about. One team that I do have a better gut feeling on is probably Brighton away at Southampton. Southampton look awful at the moment, have by far the worst XGC per 90 out of all of the 20 sides when it comes to their home data. Obviously, Southampton are playing at home to Brighton. So Hertzler, at 7.1 expected points, even though there's no table bonus there, I still think he can outperform that. They've got a good chance of a win, 61%. Only about, I think it's 18% chance of not getting anything, i.e. Southampton winning. And you'd expect a few goals there as well at the minimum. So Hertzler I quite like. I also quite like Iraola, but Wolves haven't looked too bad recently themselves. So that's put me off a little bit. So right now, if I was to make the decision today, my gut is telling me to either swing for the fences on Glasner and hope that he pulls something out of the bag against Fulham, although Fulham obviously look really good at the moment. Things change pretty quickly though, and Mateta has been banging form. Or if I wanted to play it safe, I'd probably look at Hertzler because I think the upside for goals is certainly there against a Southampton side that look all at sea at the moment and, of course, look nailed on to go down. Of course, this is a massively open debate this week and it will rumble on all the way to the deadline. So if you've got the assistant manager chip active, let me know in the comments below who you fancy. And I think more than any other chip, it really comes down to gut feel on this one. I've got a bit of a gut feeling about Glasner or Hertzler. You might have a gut feeling on Van Nistelrooy, for instance. I personally don't, but that's the beauty of this chip. We can all kind of punt on the manager and the team that we back to get a result in this specific game week, in this specific scenario. So for me, I think Glasner if I'm going to swing for the fences, Hertzler if not. Those are my two gut feelings. But let me know in the comments below where your allegiances lie and who you're most likely to go with. Right then, so let's take a look at my actual transfer plans going through to Game Week 26. Now, as I mentioned, because I'm not looking to free hit in Game Week 29, bringing in players that have a good fixture in Game Week 29, of course, also good fixtures between now and then is helpful as well. And getting rid of players that don't have a fixture in Game Week 29 is going to be where I spend most of my free transfers between now and then. I've got 2 free transfers right now. It's likely that I'll be selling Emery to bring in one of Glasner, Hertzler, maybe even someone like a McKenna if I become convinced that they have a better chance of beating Spurs than I currently feel. But that obviously limits the amount of other moves that I can make without taking hits. So if I were to, let's say, get rid of Emery right now, and for argument's sake, I'll put in Hertzler. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because he costs a little bit more than a Glasner, and it just proves a point as to where I need to get the money from. So if I bring in Hertzler away at Southampton, I think there's a good chance of a result there. Now, obviously, Glasner's 0.8, so I wouldn't need any extra money. But if I did want to buy a manager who's more expensive, I don't currently have anything in the bank to do so. So I would need to make a downgrade somewhere else in my 15 to make that something that I can do. So if I wanted Arteta, I need to find a whole extra 0.7 to upgrade a manager who costs 0.8 to a 1.5. So right now, I'm not really feeling massively confident on Arteta, but I'm not ruling it out by any means. There's obviously a pretty high chance of a win there. So I don't want to rule myself out of going there and give myself the opportunity to pick any 1.5 million value manager. So let's go with Hertzler for now, 0.3 needed. And I think the most likely way that I can make up that money is obviously to downgrade one of my Liverpool assets. Now, obviously, Mo Salah aside, he's going nowhere, but Trent and Gakpo with two pretty difficult fixtures, and of course, Gakpo in particular could be injured, seem like the most obvious routes to be getting rid of right now. I could also look at Isak, but I still think that he's a good hold, especially for Forest at home. And then he does have a good game week 28 fixture, I believe. I just want to double check that because I don't want to lie to you. West Ham away, so not bad whatsoever. Obviously blanks in 29, so that's a discussion for a later point. But in the meantime, I think he's probably okay to hold on to, whereas a potentially injured Gakpo going up against Man City and then Newcastle back-to-back is probably not a bad sale. Now, some of you out there might be thinking, I can hold on to my Liverpool assets, even Gakpo, especially if he is back for game week 26, because in a couple of weeks, he plays Southampton, and that's absolutely fine. But like I said, I'm planning on not free hitting in game week 29, and over the next stretch of 4 fixtures, there's 2 fairly difficult ones, 1 really easy one, and then a blank. And if he's even slightly injured or the minutes are slightly in doubt, then I think for me it's enough to make that move now. And one way or another, I need to be getting rid of some of these players that are blanking anyway. So for me, he makes the most sense. Trent is probably a close second, and I'll run through my route to getting rid of Trent instead of Gakpo later on in the video. So let's play this out by getting rid of Gakpo. It would give me 7.2 million to play with. Obviously, if I bring in Hertzler for Emery, that could equally be a Glasner or even cheaper. So I might have a little bit more money to play with, but a lot of the strikers I'm interested in are a bit cheaper. Now, number one, obviously, is Chris Wood, is absolutely demolishing my rank at the moment. But I'm not convinced that the next 3 fixtures in particular are the time that I want to be buying him. Newcastle, Arsenal, Man City. It's not a great run. And if I'm ever going to back against him, it makes sense to back against him now. Obviously, he's already done a load of damage, and bringing him in now would protect me against further damage. But I'm already this far down the rabbit hole. I might as well just keep going and hope that if there was a turn, it comes in the next 3 fixtures. I'm obviously going to be very interested in buying him for game week 29 away at Ipswich. So it's likely that I bring him in ahead of game week 29, but I don't think now is the right time, especially when some of his competitors in that forward position are looking pretty tasty as well. So the one that I'm most tempted by is Matheus Cunha, who's been brilliant as of late. Obviously, 2 goals in the last 2 games against Villa and then Liverpool, and some good fixtures to come. Now, Bournemouth won't be easy, nor will Fulham necessarily, but after that, game week 28 and game week 29 against Everton and Southampton look prime for attacking returns. West Ham after that, and then if for whatever reason I need to put off the wild card, or I just don't want to wild card anymore, then it's Ipswich, Spurs and Man United, followed by Leicester after that as well. So he looks like a good potential long-term hold too. It's just whether or not it's too early to be going for him now ahead of 2 arguably pretty tough fixtures against Bournemouth and Fulham. Now, the one thing I would say is that Cunha's track record, when he gets any sort of attacking return, and he does often get them, is insanely good for bonus points. Now, he obviously got 1 goal in a 2-1 loss to Liverpool, got 3 bonus points, ahead of Salah, ahead of Diaz, who returned twice, and got 2 bonus points against Villa in a 2-0 win. Looking back as well, you've got full bonus points 3 weeks in a row against Man United, Leicester and Ipswich. Ipswich again in a 2-1 loss. So you wouldn't normally expect strikers to get that. So throughout the season, we've seen consistently 30 bonus points, absolutely insane on the bonus points rankings. So if he gets any attacking return, which he is the most likely Wolves player to by quite some margin, it's not a 4-point goal, it's more like a 6 or a 7-point goal. So I think the upside is undoubtedly there. And even if they lost 2-3-1 against Bournemouth and Fulham, he might come away with 2 or 3 bonus points with a goal or an attacking return in each of those. So I really like Cunha, especially if Gakpo is ruled out or looks very shaky ahead of the Man City fixture. but he's not necessarily the only player I'd be looking at. I could also look at Yoane Wissa, who has been incredibly frustrating in the last 4 game weeks because the data's still looking really decent, but no attacking returns whatsoever. But the data does suggest that attacking returns aren't far off, and they've got Leicester next up in Game Week 26, who are, of course, going to be pretty easy to get attacking returns against, you'd think. After that, Everton, Aston Villa, and then crucially a game in Game Week 29 against Bournemouth, and much cheaper than the likes of Cunha or Chris Wood as well. So he's a good option. He's got better underlying attacking data than either of them at 0.59 XG per 90, and the minutes for last, 6 game weeks in a row now? Full 90 minutes in all of them. So the minutes aren't shaky either. So I really like Wissa. I think I slightly prefer Cunha because he's a bit more talismanic. He's obviously got a better Game Week 29 fixture as well, and the bonus points are insane, like I say. So I think the upside is slightly weighted towards Cunha there, but I don't mind Wissa either. Now, as a real outside punt that I don't mind either, Beto certainly comes to the mind right now too. So the next 4 fixtures, especially if I'm looking at wildcarding out of Game Week 29 or Game Week 30, next 4 look really good. Man United, Brentford, Wolves, West Ham, all good fixtures for attacking returns. And then, of course, the fixtures look terrible afterwards, but won't matter whatsoever if I'm wildcarding between Game Week 30 and 31. I can probably bench a 4.9 million forward for 1 week if I absolutely have to. But the data's really good, and 4 attacking returns in his last 3 game weeks, 90 minutes in the last 2. He looks like a player full of confidence, and the fixtures coming also suggest that attacking returns should continue to flow. The underlying data, 0.55 XG per 90, is also really decent, albeit off of a very small sample size, so I don't want to get carried away there. But he's 4.9 million, and you'd probably assume that he's going to be on penalties if Everton get them as well. So he ticks a lot of boxes in the meantime. And if he's a short-term punt until you look to wildcard and you're looking at getting rid of a forward and really downgrading that position, taking money out of the forward line, I do also really like Beto. So right now, my favourite, I think, is Matheus Cunha. It sets me up really nicely for Game Week 29, but I also don't mind the fixtures over the next 4. He's obviously already returned against 2 difficult opponents, and Bournemouth and Fulham won't be easy. But like I said, if he returns at all, he's good for bonus points as well. So I like Matheus Cunha, and that's probably the most likely route I'm going to take. That would be my 2 free transfers, and I'm definitely on the fence about taking a hit to remove other players. That includes João Pedro. It also includes Morgan Rogers and possibly even Trent Alexander-Arnold. Now, I'll come back to Morgan Rogers and Alexander-Arnold later on in the video. But first up, I just want to reset quickly and show you my route if I was to hold on to Gakpo instead of Trent Alexander-Arnold. Now, taking money out of my backline might not be the worst bet either, especially because the downgrade could be pretty significant. So, for example, if I was to sell Trent, there's one player right now that I really do want. He's not a forward, so I do need to change that quickly. It is, of course, Milos Kerkez. Now, his form's been pretty good. Obviously, last 2 games a bit frustrating not to get anything against Southampton in particular, but the data's not too bad, 0.09. And, of course, 5 attacking returns this season as well. Defensively as well, I'll just double check. 1.32 XGC per 90 isn't half bad. And the next 4 fixtures, in fact, even further on than that, are looking really, really strong for Bournemouth. So Wolves at home, Brighton, Spurs, Brentford, then Ipswich out the back of Game Week 29. He's a good long-term hold. And of course, at 5 million, it saves me a load of money downgrading Trent to him. And I think there's fairly similar upside in terms of the points I'd expect from each of them over the next few game weeks. Yes, Trent has that Southampton game, but he does blank in Game Week 29 and has 2 tough games before Southampton, whereas Kerkez has a run of good fixtures. The Spurs one, you'd expect maybe some goals for both sides, but Kerkez isn't any slouch going forward either, so might be good for an attacking return or 2. So I like Kerkez. It does free up money, and of course it means that I could bring in a 1.5 million manager if I wanted to for Emery. That's no problem at all. And then, of course, I get 3 million to spend once I get rid of the assistant manager come Game Week 27, and I can massively upgrade the likes of a João Pedro if I wanted to as well. So that's quite tempting, although I have to admit, out of the two, because of the doubt around Gakpo right now, I'm more likely to make the Gakpo out move to Cunha. But if Gakpo's fine, and I fancy him to score and, of course, in the first place, start against Man City, I might switch it up, because I do expect City to score against Liverpool, and make the defensive transfer from Trent to Kirkez, freeing myself up a bit more money in the process. So one of those two is very likely to happen. So let's say I make one of those two moves in terms of Trent or Gakpo out. I'll obviously also be making the assistant manager move, so I'll bring in Hertzler for the time being, but you know my thoughts around which managers I might be going for. So that's my 2 free transfers either way. So what else would I potentially be willing to do with my side? Now, of course, there's a few issues with my starting 11 and my 15 generally right now, and I could be tempted to being a bit more aggressive than I have been in recent weeks to get back on the front foot, to remove some of the deadwood in my side and place myself better ahead of Gameweek 29, where I can use the rest of my free transfers between now and then on more aggressive moves and attack that upside. Now, obviously, taking a hit this game week in a non-double game week is less likely to pay off, but I think at times this season I've been a little bit too cautious and maybe not taken the bull by the horns where necessary. This seems like a fairly reasonable idea, especially because there are some players out there that have either A, lost their place in the side, looking at João Pedro, or B, have a blank coming and not great fixtures between now and then as well, whilst their competitors at around the same sort of price point do have good fixtures and then also play in Game Week 29. So whilst a hit is very rarely optimal, it might be the best for my team to get back on the front foot and kind of fix all of my issues in one. Now, obviously, I've already mentioned the assistant manager move almost certainly needs to be made. That's 1 free transfer. I'll probably be removing one of the Liverpool boys, either Trent or Gakpo. I could look at removing both, but I think it's more likely I just do one at a time. And then the hit would probably be to remove either João Pedro or Morgan Rogers. Now, Morgan Rogers is probably the slightly more likely player to go because he's currently in my starting 11, whereas with João Pedro, as much as I'd love to get rid of him, he's at the very least looking to be on my bench this week as someone that I just don't expect to start against Southampton. And also, the amount of things that I can actually do with João Pedro this week is fairly limited. Now, if I were to sell Trent to bring in Kirkez, then I could look at potentially selling João Pedro for the likes of Matheus Cunha or Wissa as well, because I would have some money spare. But it also means that I'd still have a potentially injured Gakpo to worry about too. So I think it's more likely that I sort out the Morgan Rogers issue. Not necessarily that he's definitely an issue going into Chelsea at home, but I do think that Villa could be a bit tired going into their 3rd game in the space of a week, although they're all at home. Going up against Ipswich, then Liverpool, then Chelsea back to back to back isn't ideal, and I do feel like players like Morgan Rogers and Villa generally might be a bit leggy by the time they get to Chelsea. We'll obviously see how energetic they look against Liverpool, but it's something that I'm not ruling out. And if I was to remove Morgan Rogers, there are a few low-hanging fruits that I'd definitely be interested in. Now, number 1 would be the Bournemouth players. Now, depending on who I were to sell, i.e. Gakpo for Cunha, for instance, I probably wouldn't be able to go for Kluivert because I wouldn't have the spare money to make that upgrade. If I was to sell Trent instead and bring in Kirkez, then I've actually got the money to upgrade Rogers to Kluivert in one move. So I do like Kluivert, but I think because I'm slightly more likely, as I described earlier on in the video, to get rid of Gakpo than Trent because of that potential injury, I'm more likely than not looking at probably bringing in Dango than Kluivert. Now, that's not because I necessarily prefer him, but he is much cheaper. The form is good, as is the data. And I think for the next 4 game weeks, maybe 5, which is the time span I probably need him for before wildcarding, I think he's relatively safe, and I think his minutes will be pretty secure until they start bringing players like Evan Nilsson back in. Now, up until this point, we've been seeing good minutes ever since that injury, basically. And the last 5 game weeks in particular, it's got 90 in 4 of them and got taken off very slightly early against Southampton after obviously getting his goal as well. So I'm pretty confident that he's okay for minutes. I could look at the likes of a Minte or potentially a Nwaneri as well, but I'm a little bit more confident in the minutes and also the expected upside over the next 4 game weeks of a Dango or a Cliver. Dango makes more sense because I can afford him if I were to get rid of Gakpo, bring in Cunha. Now, if I was to get rid of João Pedro, then my options are much more limited. I could look at bringing in Beto straight away because obviously he's cheaper, but I'm pretty set on the makeup of what I want my front 3 to be come game week 29. And Beto, although he's been very good recently, he's not part of my ideal front 3. That front 3 ideally would be Acuna, it would be Wood, and then probably either Haaland or Marmoush. Now, obviously, that means there's no space for bringing in Beto, and if I were to make that transfer now, I would either have to make peace with holding him for game week 29 or make another transfer down the line. So I think for me, that João Pedro spot needs to become either Chris Wood or an Erling Haaland, potentially a Marmoush as well. And for now, I can't afford to do that. So that probably just gets kicked another week down the line, as annoying as that is. And I'll probably just hold on to João Pedro on the bench for the meantime. Obviously, I could go the alternative route, which is to get rid of Trent, get Kerkez in, and then I've got a bit more money to play with, and I could upgrade João Pedro straight to Cunha this week. But like I said, because I'm expecting Gakpo to still be a doubt going into Man City away, I'm preparing for the more likely possibility that I need to make the move there rather than Trent, who is probably going to be fit and is potentially benchable against Man City away. I could look at starting Hall instead, but ideally I'd still want him for Southampton in game week 28. So obviously in the meantime, I'm locking in 2 moves almost certainly. That'll be one of the Liverpool boys out for either Kerkez if it was Trent, Cunha if it was Gakpo most likely. I could look at Wissa of course as well. And then potentially even going more aggressive and taking a hit to take out Morgan Rogers against Chelsea, which might not be a bad play in the first place for someone like a Dango. Or look at removing João Pedro if it's Trent that I get rid of instead of Gakpo, and then I could upgrade to Cunha as well. In the meantime, obviously, I've talked about a few different routes I could be taking. I'm not locking in anything yet because, of course, we've still got the Aston Villa-Liverpool match to be played, and we'll get team news and we'll get press conferences between now and then. But let me know in the comments below what you think of those different routes, which you prefer, and, of course, if you've got any of your own dilemmas, just chuck them in the comments below, and I'm more than happy to get back to as many of you as possible before the Game Week 26 deadline. If you've enjoyed today's video, leave a like, hit subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my ramblings because I don't really know where I'm going just yet, but hopefully it's valuable nonetheless. And I look forward to chatting to you again later on this week as we lock in, or try to lock in, my team selection ahead of the deadline.